Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And as you can see, we're back in the CDB TV headquarters after our recent journey south to cover that fantastic Helsington Classic Scramble weekend. I hope you enjoyed all of the bikes and all of that racing from that particular event. But today we're back to domestic chores once again, and so we're going to continue with our series of looking at these classic 125 machines, and we have another nice array of 125s for you to take a look at in this part 3 clip. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into our first machine. Okay, so let's get this part 3 of our brand new series of looking at 125s underway and take a look at Sean McCree's quite nice looking 125 RM Suzuki twin shocker. Now, as to the actual year of Sean's bike, it's not that easy to calculate because this bike is made up from a bit of a mishmash of other Suzuki models, so it's anything but an original bike, and in its way it's a bit of a hybrid and a little bit of a Suzuki mongrel. But then again, Sean never really set out to build a bike that was from any particular year. He just wanted to put together a little RM Suzuki 125 twin shock bike that he could race at the weekend, although why he didn't just go out and try and find a complete RM125 in the first place is anybody's guess. Now, the chassis on this bike has certainly undergone some serious surgery and welding, and for what reason is unclear to me, although I expect it was all done to accommodate this air-cooled 125 Suzuki motor that he's used as his power source. But nevertheless, this is still a quite nice looking piece of kit, and it all seems to fit together very well because Sean's quite a good engineer and very handy with the spanners and the welder when he's building these kind of bikes. And so with regards to the actual year of manufacture of this Suzuki 125 air-cooled motor, I just haven't a clue, but possibly it could be maybe from a 1979 or even 1980 bike. And the front forks again are also a bit of a mystery because Sean never actually furnished me with any of the details of the parts on this bike, but he was quite explicit to explain that the bike was made up from various other Suzuki models. Although certainly a very nice strong box section type of alloy swing arm on our Bitsa Suzuki. Again, from which bike I don't actually know, but we certainly recognise those very nice pair of twin shocks that are bolted onto that swing arm. These of course are a pair of very high quality Swedish made piggyback Öhlins shocks. Now, this very nice alloy fuel tank is actually a part that Sean made himself to fit his custom built Suzuki frame, so as I said, he certainly has some skills when it comes to fabricating bespoke parts for his race bikes, because he's certainly made a great job of shaping and welding this lovely fuel tank. But without doubt, this is still a very well put together little bike, and quite quick as well, as I remember when I saw it running on the track some time later after taking these video clips. But stock, original or not, you can see that Sean's bike just looks right, and all of those various parts that have been borrowed from other Suzuki machines certainly all seem to come together in one fine looking package. Okay, so we're back once more to the Terry Pickering Classic Dirt Bike Collection to check out Terry's 1978 Italian-made Aspes CRC 125. Now, as we've said before, Terry has quite a good collection of very rare and interesting classics in his collection. Some, of course, he has restored himself, and others he's purchased from other bike collectors, which is the case here when he bought this Italian Aspes 125 from his friend and bike collector Dave Drabble. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is still a quite original bike from 1978, which hasn't undergone any kind of restoration or refurbishment in its 45 years or so, although I certainly have noticed a brand new set of replacement wheels on the bike, but yet again another beautifully designed Italian stallion. Although it was certainly a stonking little 125 two-stroke motor that powered our Aspes 125, which had a 6-speed gearbox and just your standard wet multi-plate clutch as well. But these two-stroke piston port engines were also used to great success powering other kinds of motorcycles and even four-wheeled racing go-karts as well. Now, to fuel our 125 engine, it was, as you'd expect, a big Italian-made Dell'Orto carburetor that fed our Aspes with its gas, and it also had these big radial cooling fins, not unlike the Maicos of their day, just to try and help keep that motor cool. But Aspes, just like many of the other small Italian motorcycle manufacturers, began by making bicycles for the masses of Italians who needed to get around their small villages and towns with their narrow streets, before then turning on to building small CC motorcycles, and then eventually moving on to the off-road market with these lovely looking 125 crossers. But the very first Aspes motorcycles certainly date back to about 1969, which I'm sure was the Cross Special that was fitted with a very small Minarelli 50cc motor, and later Aspes launched their off-road bike, the Aspes Hoppy 125, about 1974, but their off-road machines were very light, very quick, and they could certainly keep up with most of the European 125s of their day. Now, the Aspes motorcycle company even had their own subsidiary at the factory that made their own type of front forks, although these rear twin shocks that are fitted to our bike are probably locally sourced Italian Marzoccis, or maybe something a little bit similar. Now again, the bike's rear swing arm was just a pretty simple box section steel type of construction, although, as I said, those gold plated alloy SM Pro wheels are more than likely brand new replacements. But nevertheless, this is still a cracking example of one of these relatively rare Italian Aspes lightweight racers, and if you were a rider and racer in the UK in 1978, then you probably would have been very hard pressed to see or even race against one of these Aspes 125s in that year, because very few ever entered the UK, and even less were ever exported internationally. But in their native Italy in the late 1970s, you would certainly still see a very good swarm of these smaller 125s taking part in all kinds of enduro or scrambling race events. So again, another very rare specimen from the vast Terry Pickering classic dirt bike collection. But next up, we're going back to the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show to take a look at our next 125, and this time It's a 1979 Honda CR125 that was actually offered up for sale at the show on the day for just £6,000, but whether the vendor actually sold the bike on the day, I don't know. Now this bike, of course, has undergone a full restoration, as you can probably guess, and it's certainly a stunning example of one of these iconic CR125s from the late 1970s. Now I do remember in 1979 Honda labelled these bikes as the closest thing you could get to a works bike of its day, and although it was still essentially a decent bike, it wasn't perfect by any means. But without doubt, this little 125 Honda powerhouse was a great little motor which allegedly pumped out about 24 horsepower, but it had a 6-speed gearbox, as I remember, and it was fueled through a lightweight grid pattern type reed valve intake. Now, as part of the restoration, this motor has also had a full rebuild, and this engine here was given the full strip down and rebuild treatment by Mark Freudenau at MHF Restorations, who of course has a very good reputation for the quality of his work when it comes to restoring these kind of classic motorcycles. And this bike here even still has its original expansion chamber from 1979, which is very unusual on a bike of over 40 years old, as most of these older Hondas by this time have had their stock original pipes changed to a pattern replacement item. Now the forks again on these little Hondas were functional and exactly what you'd expect on a very small 125 off-road bike. They certainly worked reasonably well, but it was probably best just to keep any airtime or big tabletop jumps to a minimum, as they certainly weren't very strong or had enough damping or rebound force to cope with harsh landings on rough racetracks. Which of course brings us to Honda's big innovation on their 1979 125, which was to introduce their 23-inch front wheel, which they said was designed to cope better with bumps and big holes in the track. And because this bike had the much larger diameter wheel at the front, it would just simply float over the bumps, but the reality and true operation was of course no different to a standard 21-inch wheel. And naturally, because our brand new Honda had a 23-inch wheel, it had to be fitted with a 23-inch tyre, which Honda called their claw action tyre, and astonishingly it was a tyre that only Honda made, and there wasn't another single manufacturer on the planet who were making replacement motocross tyres for a 23-inch front wheel. And not only that, these claw action tyres were made of rubber compound so hard that you could use it for 50 years and it would certainly not wear out. And if you ever wanted to change it for another Honda 23-inch tyre, you basically had to cut it off the rim because the rubber was so hard. But Honda, of course, soon saw the error of their design, and then they ditched the 23-inch wheel in favour of a much more sensible 21-inch unit on their new 1980 bike. Although, to be fair, most of our little CR125 was still a decent little bike, because it did have a relatively light and flickable chrome moly steel frame and swing arm, and a little belter of a 6-speed 2-stroke reed valve motor. And the front and rear suspension was also functional and just what you'd expect on a smaller 125 motocrosser from that year. But having said all that, this particular example here has been expertly restored and would certainly be a very nice bit of history to add to anybody's classic dirt bike collection. And so we're just going to hang around the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show to take a look at our next 125, and this lovely YZ125 Yamaha is David Farmer's current race bike. Now again, I'm not actually sure of the year of David's YZ. It could possibly be a 1980 or even a 1981 model, because yet again I wasn't actually told on the day as to the bike's details. But again, another lovely looking specimen of a bike. Not a stock machine again, because it does have different forks and maybe a couple of other non-standard items bolted onto it, but nevertheless it's still a wee cracker of a 125. But without doubt, these YZ125 two-stroke reed valve 6-speed motors were always considered by many off-road bike experts of their day to be one of the best 125 motocross motors of that early 1980s period. And it was quite amazing the power and the speed that you could gain from such a small, compact little engine. But of course, just like all 125 motocrossers, you have to keep that engine buzzing and keep your left foot dancing up and down on that shifter. And if you can manage to do that, you would certainly keep your YZ125 up there at the sharp end of the racing pack. Now, as I just mentioned, these front forks on David's bike are not the original units for this machine, as these are a much stronger and beefier set, probably taken from a larger capacity off-road bike, but from which make of machine, again, I don't know. And at the back end of our YZ125, it was just a single non-linkage monoshock suspension unit that ran from the swing arm up the backbone of the bike to just underneath that fuel tank. But the bike's rear swing arm was Yamaha's tried and tested monocross alloy setup, which again was both light and very strong, and David's even customised it a little bit by adding this very nice alloy YZ brake torque arm for a little bit of personalisation on his own machine. Now, certainly at the time I grabbed these video clips, David was hobbling around the show on a pair of crutches because he had a bad spill at a race event at Farleigh Castle just some weeks before. But of course that was a way back in February of 2023, so hopefully now David's back up and fit enough again to swing his leg over his little YZ125 and get back onto the track. Okay, so for our next 125 bike in this brand new series, we're dipping into the Terry Pickering collection once again to take a look at this quite rare and lovely looking 1979 125 Maico twin shocker. Now, as I mentioned in the previous Terry Pickering bike, Terry often farms out his restorations to other experts, and this featured bike here is a machine that was built by Terry's mate and of course one-time Kramer works rider Keith Ree. Now, Keith has certainly plenty experience when it comes to building and restoring these old Maicos, because he did have a spell as a team rider on a Maico at one time, but our feature bike here is at least 99% authentic, although it does have a couple of smaller parts that were maybe not from that year. But on the face of it, when you look at these smaller 125 Maicos, they do look very similar in their frame construction to the bigger bikes, although as I recall, I think these 125s did have a much smaller inner diameter tubing, and the engine mounts as well were different from the bigger engined machines. Now this little 125 Maico motor is not like the bigger engined 1979 bikes of that year, as these little 125 strokers had a very unique fuel induction system, which basically consisted of a rotating fibre disc on the end of the crankshaft that spun past a predetermined cutout in the crankcase, where it then created suction, sucking the fuel and air mixture into the motor. Now some of the Japanese bikes back in the day used a similar system to this, because I do remember my old 1970s Yamaha YB100 certainly had a similar setup to this Maico, but it was quite a good system, and it did appear to work quite well in practice, although the Achilles heel of these 125s wasn't the power of the motor or lack of it. It was the transmission or selector part of the gearbox that tended to let the engine down, because bad gear changes and broken transmission parts were certainly very common on these 1979 125s. But exactly what all the transmission problems were down to, I'm not entirely sure, but the shaft that housed the Kickstarter was certainly hollow, and the gear shifter selector shaft passed through the middle of it, but whether it was this design that had anything to do with the gearbox's reliability, I'm not too sure. But when everything was working as it should, this was still a very quick little engine. Now once again, the front suspension on the bike was pretty much the self-same forks that were used on the bigger 250 and 400 bikes, so they were certainly well up to the job of this 125, but the front brake again was just a stock Maico part as used on the bigger bikes, although this rear hub and brake was of a much smaller diameter than its bigger siblings, and for what reason I'm not entirely sure, but it was still a light little bike in terms of its overall weight, so stopping it wasn't really an issue. But as you can see, quite a small rear drive sprocket compared to the much larger Maicos of their day, but this is more than likely all done to give the little Maico a decent top end speed when it's being ridden on the track. But once again, these 125 Maicos shared the exact same alloy fuel tanks and seat as the bigger bikes, and for me personally speaking, I still think these 79 alloy tanks were still among some of the most stylish fuel cells that Maico ever produced, and as you'd expect, they did hold more than enough gas to feed that disc valve induction 125 two-stroke engine. But I certainly do remember that these 125 Maicos were very pricey to buy in 1979, and if you wanted to buy one in the USA in that year, they were near enough the $1,000 mark, which was a crazy price when you consider that an equivalent 125 Kawasaki at the time it was only $650, and even the bigger 400 Maicos in that year it was only $100 more than the little 125. So you can see why these little Maicos didn't sell well, and with those troublesome transmission, that of course only added to its problems. But very few were actually made in the first place, and even less were sold, which is quite a shame because essentially this was still a good little bike, but unfortunately it wasn't without its problems. Okay, so just to finish off this part 3 in our 125 dirt bike classic series is this 1992 Minsk Motovelo 125, a bike very unlike the Italian or Japanese bikes that we've just seen previously. This is a bike that was built in Belarus, and every single component on this bike was manufactured in the same factory. Now currently this bike is owned by Willsport man Bill Brown, and this is just one of many 125 Minsk Motovelo bikes that Bill purchased many years ago, and in fact he still has several of these models brand new still in their packing crates at Willsport HQ. And as you can see, this bike is number 0468 off the production line in that year. But back in the day, the Minsk company began by producing bicycles for the Russian market before then moving on to building their first ever motorcycle in 1951. And their aim was really just to provide cheap and easy to maintain machines, which they exported to countries like Vietnam, which was just one of their biggest markets in their early days. Now, although our Motovelo 125 isn't that much to look at, you have to remember that even in 1992 your average Belarusian wasn't earning that much of a wage, and these kind of off-road bikes would have probably been a bit of a luxury that they couldn't afford, as most opted to go for a road type of Minsk machine that they could use to move around. But as you can gather, these Minsks were powered by a very simple piston port two-stroke 125 engine, which, as I said, every single component, including the carburetor, were all made inside the Minsk factory. Now, this motor may look a bit agricultural compared to maybe an equivalent Japanese bike, but these motors were made so that they could be maintained with the minimum of tools, and there was nothing really complicated about the engines either, so your average mechanic could certainly repair them quite easily. But with regards the performance of this Minsk motor, I don't suspect that it would be much of a threat to an RM Suzuki or maybe a CR125 Honda, but then again I expect it was never built to take on the finest and fastest 125 off-road machines on the Grand Prix circuit. This was more of a fun bike, or for commuters who just wanted a bit more ground clearance when they were travelling on some of those rough Russian roads. And as you can gather from these video clips, it was just a very simple, no-nonsense kind of an engine that's still used old school flathead screws and old style fasteners to keep it all together. And if you were an owner of one of these Minsk 125s in 1992, then you'd certainly want to be able to repair it cheaply if anything should go wrong, which I'm told it often did. And again, the bike's fuel tank was made of light gauge steel. Certainly no plastic or fiberglass fuel cells on these bikes, even in 1992. And again, a simple turn and twist type of fuel tap. Although it was probably best maybe not to try any big airtime tabletop jumps with this front suspension system, which again was probably maybe not even up to road bike standards of its day, but it was very basic in its construction, and once again old school steel wheels and not the lighter alloy items that you'd expect on an equivalent 125/92 off-roader. But at the front end it was a simple drum brake that probably would manage to eventually bring our little Minsk 125 to a quick stop. And as we take a look around the bike, you can certainly get an idea of just how simple and uncomplicated its construction actually is. And even these Russian-made knobbly tyres were all manufactured inside the Motovelo factory. But of course, as we look around the components and the parts on this bike, we would think that these had come from a bike in 1952 and not 1992. But you have to remember that it was almost impossible to import Western parts into Belarus at this time, so factories like Minsk had to design, manufacture and even find all the raw materials to make the parts to build these motorcycles. And despite that huge drawback, they still sold millions of motorcycles to the masses. And at the rear end of our 125 Minsk, it was just another very basic pair of dampers and springs with no real means of fine adjustment, of course apart from the screw shifters at the bottom of each shock. But these were very unlike our Western parts fitted to our particular off-roaders. But as I said, a quite rare machine to even see here in the UK, let alone even see one on a racetrack. But our 1992 Minsk 125 is never going to win the nicest looking bike at the next Classic Scramble concourse competition, because it was never ever built for that kind of purpose. Its main focus was just to bring cheap, easy to maintain transport to the masses, and maybe even have a bit of fun or green laning in the process. But without doubt, a very unusual bike, and very rare to see or even find one here in the UK. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a look at the latest batch of 125 dirt bikes in our brand new series, and some quite rare machines there, especially that little Minsk Motovelo 125, which is a very rare bike to see here in the UK. But of course, next week we're off on our travels once again to the south of the country to cover another classic racing event, and we'll be heading to Penrith, to Bassenthwaite to be precise, to cover another classic racing weekend. But of course you can see all of the bikes and all of the action that took place on the track by simply subscribing to my channel. But from all of us here at CDB TV for the time being, it's goodbye for now.